Hello, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate Rural Talk Radio Network, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. The views of the guest may not represent those of the host of the station. Folks, I have a very interesting guest with me today. As I always do, I learn from every guest, and today is no exception. With me today is Dr. Benjamin Lewin, who obtained his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Cambridge, England. He became the first editor of Nature New Biology in 1971 and then worked at the National Cancer Institute from 1972 to 1973. He founded Cell, C-E-L-L, Journal in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1974 and remained editor of Cell until 1999. Cell became the top-ranked journal in the life sciences. Dr. Lewin is also the author of the best-selling Genes textbook and a series of books on wine. He divides his time between New York City and London. And Dr. Benjamin Lewin is here to discuss his new book, Inside Science, Revolution in Biology and its Impact. Welcome, Dr. Benjamin Lewin, to Chatting with Betsy.
Hello, thank you.
You are welcome. I've always been fascinated with science and biology. Dr. Lewin, I always ask my guests who have written books, is what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I've thought for quite a while that science is not very well understood by non-scientists. There's a very sort of stylized view. You might almost say a caricature. People see science as a sort of black box that gives results, but they don't really understand the system of science, how it works. And if you don't understand how the system works, you just have to accept what science says or reject it. And I don't think either of those is a good place to be. So what I wanted to do in this book was to show how science really works, to disentangle myth from reality, explain that it's a messy process, that it is in the long run reliable because it corrects itself if it makes an error. But of course, in the short run, there can be mistakes. And once you understand how the system works, its strengths and weaknesses, you're in a much better position to assess science and deal with it. That's what I wanted to accomplish.
And I want to thank you for writing this book. I have a question for you that in reading about, the research papers and what goes into publishing, research, do you feel there's a lot of competition and possible fraud that goes on in presenting information?
Science is intensely competitive, or at least in the subjects that are the most researched. Very competitive. There's a saying, publish or perish, which goes back to the 1940s, meaning that if you don't publish stuff, you sort of drop out of the system, you won't get tenure at your university, you won't get funds to do more research, and so on. And obviously, when you have a system that is that intense and that competitive, there is always a risk of fraud. There have been frauds over the past 20, 30 years that we know about. There probably are some we don't know about. But the nature of science is that it really is, as I said before, self-correcting. So when a paper is published, other people will do experiments based on the assumption that what that paper said is correct. And if it was a fraud, if it was made up and the data are not correct, those subsequent experiments won't work. And at that point, they will go back and challenge the original paper. And if the authors of the original paper can't defend it adequately, it will be judged to be wrong, not necessarily fraudulent, of course, but certainly wrong. And most cases where there have been frauds have come out of challenges of that sort. The data didn't seem right, somebody else challenged it, and it turned out to be a fraud. I would say that, of course, most cases where science is wrong are not fraud. They're just mistakes or misunderstandings.
When I was reading part of your book, it brought me back to a memory. I think it was a couple of years ago that was just devastating to the Alzheimer's community. Was the not the correct information about, I guess, what was causing the Alzheimer's. It was they had to start all over again.
Yes, the surprise of that is that it took so long to be discovered. Usually, if it's a hot topic like Alzheimer's or AIDS or COVID, and something is published that is really, really wrong, it will actually be unmasked pretty fast. This was a real oddity because it took much longer than you would have expected for it to be shown that it was wrong. It's very unfortunate.
Yes. I was deeply crushed, as well as the Alzheimer's community, because I had members, my family, my husband one, affected by Alzheimer's, and you think, they found something, but I hope that they continue to do research and find a cure eventually, or at least something that will help. And I know it's very difficult with the brain.
It is. I'm sure that will happen in time, but it probably will take time. One of the points to be made there is that you just never know where the great discoveries will come from. And it's all very well to try to direct science to say this is a problem that society needs fixing, but by and large that's not the best way to do it, because very often the great discoveries come from something which appeared to be completely unrelated when the discovery was made, and years later sometimes it turns out that it has great significance. For example, the CRISPR gene editing technique comes out of what was at the time, what seemed to be some very obscure work on bacteria. In fact, the authors had a lot of trouble getting funded because the general argument was, well, why do we want to do this work? It's not very relevant to anything. But 20 years later, it turned out that was where the CRISPR technique came from.
I'd like to ask you this, Dr. Lewin. How difficult is it for a scientist to get funding, or a institute to get funding to do research to maybe find a cure?
It's become more difficult. Getting funding has become very competitive, and the problem with the system is that it's a bit of a catch-22. To get funded to do some research, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got some reasonable likelihood the research will work. To be able to do that, you need to have some funds in order to get some of the data. So the problem with that is that in order to get funded, people game the system. You get a grant to do one thing, and you spend some of it doing something else in order to prove the point that you can apply for your next grant and get it successfully. So it's difficult, and the system, in my opinion, doesn't really work very well. I would like to see a system in which instead of funding projects, we fund people. We basically say, if your last 5 years of research were productive, we'll fund you for another 5 years. You do whatever you want with it, and we'll fund you for 5 years. And the worst that would happen is at the end of the 5 years, you would say, oh, well, you didn't have any very good ideas. We won't fund you anymore. That would probably waste a lot less in the way of resources than the present system, where a principal investigator running even quite a small laboratory may spend 30, 40, 50% of their time trying to raise money to do the research, instead of doing what they're qualified to do, which is research.
I think research in biology is just incredible. I used to work as a nurse, but when I was training in the OR, I don't know, maybe I'm kind of morbid. I loved to see the body organs, but I just think it's fascinating how the human body just works. I mean, it's just fascinating to me. Could you explain to the audience what epigenetics is, and how does that play a role for the future?
Oh, that's a tough question.
That might be a loaded question.
Very low. Epigenetics is probably the most controversial area in biological research at the moment. So if we go back a bit, we have the basic concept that inheritance comes from your genes. Your genes are made of DNA, and DNA is a sequence of 4 different types of unit. And that sequence is the genetic information which determines how your body develops, how any organism develops. It turns out that one of those 4 bases, one of those 4 units, can be modified inside the organism, and that this is part of the process of controlling how genes work. That's not at all controversial, although we don't understand it completely yet. The controversial bit is the proposal that after that modification has been made, it might be inherited by the next generation. That's epigenetics. The idea that the environment can change something in your DNA and that your children will inherit it. Now, I have to say there is fairly good evidence for some epigenetic effects in plants. There is not very good evidence in animals, and I don't think there's any that really stands up in humans. So the jury is out at the moment as to whether this is a real effect or not. If it were a real effect, it would amount to a heresy in terms of current genetic thinking, because the entire model for a century has been that the environment cannot modify genetics. If epigenetics were true, that would be reversed. My own view is that there is no good evidence yet. A lot of people believe in it. A lot of people are trying to get evidence. It's a very hot topic, and it's very controversial.
Yes, when I think of epigenetics and changing, genes or chromosomes around, I can't help but think of World War II and the mad scientist of Germany and what experiments they did to have the super pure race, which is what that makes me think of. But also in the States, they were doing, experiments on people that people did not know about till much later. But when you think about a mad scientist going in and trying to change someone's DNA, chromosomes, so that they would be blonde hair, blue-eyed, maybe, that's a guy 6 feet tall. It's kind of scary, to think that.
The possibility of genetic engineering is scary. At the moment, there's a worldwide moratorium on doing anything like that. I think you have to remember that science is always two-edged. I think Robert Oppenheimer says something to the effect that we do science because we're curious, and it's up to society to be responsible about how it uses it. And that's always true. There's always a potential for people to abuse science. That shouldn't stop us doing science, but it probably should make us careful about controlling its uses. I don't think there's any real prospect of any genetic engineering that will affect the human race being done in the short order. In the long order, who knows? It might even be that artificial intelligence is a greater threat to humanity.
Yes, that is getting to be a very, very hot topic. What worries you about AI in conjunction with science?
Well, what worries me is that it has the potential to change the way we do science. So there's a principle in science, which is when you publish results, you publish them in such a way that somebody else who wants to can repeat your experiments. That means that if there's a question, someone else can do it again, and if they support you, that's great. And if they don't, then you have to sort out what went wrong. Artificial intelligence, by its very name, does not work like that. very often the people who designed an artificial intelligence program don't completely understand how it works. So if you use artificial intelligence to analyze scientific results and it gives you a conclusion, you have no real means of verifying it. That means that if there is a discrepancy down the road, you can't go back to the original experiment and repeat it because you don't have control of it. That worries me because although AI has great potential, there are situations in which it can analyze a large amount of data much more quickly and effectively than say, human intuition. But if we can't reproduce it, if we don't know how it works, how can we fully trust its results? That's what worries me.
I could see that. So, in other words, when someone does research, experiments, so on, using their own mental capacity, there's proof because it's written down, it's been shown. So with AI, you're getting it from this AI that there's not the proof then, because the AI right. didn't do the experiment, right?
And also, there is more willingness to accept something which is produced by AI than if a human does it. Here's an example. So, first photograph of a black hole was made a few years back, and then it was reanalyzed recently using AI. And the picture looks fairly different from the original picture. AI says that instead of a very sort of fuzzy area with some light around it, we have a very tight area with a very thin ring of light. And that seems to be accepted. But if a real live person had said, look, I'm looking at the original figure, I think it's too fuzzy, we should make it tighter, there'd be yells of you can't do that, or maybe even fraud. But because it's an AI program, people accept it. That worries me.
Right, changing the picture or changing the results is what AI can do.
Yes, it can interpret them in a way that goes beyond what you or I would do if we were looking at the results, and that's a concern.
Yeah, I could see where that could lead to a huge problem. It's so interesting. My son and I went to see the movie yesterday, The Creator, about artificial intelligence, and I slept through a lot of it, but it's kind of scary because it's not that far off. They're making robots now. They'll look like people.
There are people who believe that the singularity, the moment when computers achieve human level intelligence, is quite close. I don't know myself. It's really, really hard to say. Certainly, judging from my conversations with ChatGPT, we're not close to AI replacing people.
Well, that's a good thing. I think, you're absolutely right. I think science, AI, and just really about anything, even the Internet, when placed in the wrong hands, can be dangerous. When it's used for good and helping people, then it's wonderful. So
that's always been true, of course. Scientists are really motivated by curiosity. They're not really motivated by. I should qualify that. Of course, there are a lot of scientists who work in sort of medical matters, and they really want to cure some disease, sometimes for personal reasons. But the general motivation for science is curiosity, and it was, again, Oppenheimer who basically said, when you see an interesting problem, you go for solving it. After you've solved it, you worry about what to do with it. And that's still pretty much true. Sometimes results come out like genetic engineering, and it wasn't anticipated when you started doing the research that was where it would go. You never know where research will go.
That's true. That's true. I was talking about Oppenheimer. I saw the movie, and it was just incredible because I didn't know all that much about, Oppenheimer, knew some, about the atomic bomb.
Yes.
But I thought that movie definitely showed, okay, we created something, and this is the result. What have we done?
Yes, sure.
And it just blew my mind. How did you end up becoming a critic of science instead of a researcher? You were a researcher. Were you a researcher at one time?
Very briefly. But when I was doing research, I found that it required 100% of my time to be in the laboratory doing research. And there was no time for going to the library to read. There was no time for understanding other areas of science. And for me, that took away the point of the exercise. For me, the point of science is to understand what is going on in as wide an area as possible. And focusing on one problem, exclusively one problem and nothing else, just took away the whole point of it for me. So I ended up becoming the editor of a scientific journal and writing books and in effect becoming a critic of science. It's a funny thing in science. There's no tradition of people becoming critics. In the arts, you can be a critic of theatre, you can be a critic of music, you can be a critic of paintings. You don't necessarily have to do the work. In science, there is certainly still somewhat of a feeling that a scientist does research and that you're not a legitimate scientist unless you do research. And I had to contend with that to some degree when I was doing this. But, you know, science is different.
I think science, maybe it's, to me, kind of like medicine. You know, it's trial and error. Okay, this doesn't work, so let's try trying this way with experiments. Would you say it's trial and error type of situation?
I think science is a pretty messy process. It's not a straight line. It's more a sort of zigzag.
Right.
There's a sort of view of science, a sort of mythic view, that you form a hypothesis, you do some experiments to test the hypothesis, and then depending on the results, you form another hypothesis, you do some more experiments, and so on. There is some of that in science, sure, but for the most part, science does not work like that. It's much more along the lines you just suggested. You get some result in your lab, you say, oh, that's a bit odd, don't quite understand what's going on there, let's have a look, and you do something else. And eventually it works out to something which you can put into a theoretical framework. And when you write your paper to report the results, you will present it as though you were testing an absolutely logical sequence right from the beginning. But the fact is, science is not logical. It's very messy. It goes up, it goes down, it goes around. Many great discoveries are made by accident. And, that's something I would like people to understand.
Yes. Sometimes, I guess a scientist could be doing something, maybe trying to find a cure for something, and then finds a cure. Oh no, this will cure something else, or this might help another area.
Well, there are plenty of drugs that have emerged from attempt to do one thing, and it turned out they had an effect on something else. That's really not uncommon at all.
Yes. I can't think right now off the top of my head of scientists discovering something to help one thing and something else. Was it penicillin for mold?
Penicillin was an absolute accident, yes. Alexander Fleming left some Petri dishes out. They should have been washed up and cleaned, and they weren't. And sort of 2 days later, there was an area that was cleared of mold on them. And when they investigated what was growing in there, that was penicillin. But it was an accident. But one famous scientist who got a Nobel Prize for a discovery in physics that was accidental said, accidents don't happen accidentally in science. And what he meant was you have to be prepared to see what things mean. There are plenty of accidents that happen in labs and people don't notice them and they don't make the discovery. And someone else notices it and there's a great discovery.
That's amazing to me. That it really is. Science and finding cures, creating vaccines to, help people. I mean, in my own opinion, we're living longer because of scientists researching.
Partly. It's a fair debate to whether when the increase in life expectancy occurred in the 19th century, it was more due to the effects of science making their way into medicine or more due to improvements in public sanitation. It's an interesting debate. Certainly, changes in society, like sanitation, clean water and so on, clean water, sewers and so on, have had a big effect on life expectancy as well. Vaccinations was probably the biggest single thing that increased life expectancy in, say, the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yes, all the vaccinations, the polio. There, I got it out.
Polio, smallpox, and so on. Yes.
Smallpox. Yes, I remember getting those dreaded booster shots in the arm hurting. And what was the sugar cube? I remember that.
Oh, that was polio. That was the live polio vaccine, the Salk vaccine.
Yeah, that I remember. See, what's funny, Dr. Lewin? I can remember the sugar cube, but don't ask me what I ate last week.
That's actually a common problem as you get older. Your memory of distant things is quite good, and your memory of what you did 5 minutes ago is gone. It's one of those things. One day maybe when we understand brain function better, we will understand why that is.
Yes, I have discovering that as I am now. I cannot believe it. Will be. Well, I am in my mid-60s. I'm going to be 66 in December, and I was like, I can't believe it. And I can remember things from sometimes, like way back, and you can't remember recent
right.
some recent things.
I only admit to more than 35 and less than 120, but I definitely find that my memory of distant things is pretty clear. My memory of very recent things is not so clear.
Yeah, that's very common. What would you like to see? This might be a very broad question, but what would you like to see in research that's not being done now?
That is a difficult question. It's not so much what I'd like to see, because, as I said before, I think it's really hard to forecast what research will lead where. But what I would like to see is a return to the attitude that we had 20 or 30 years ago, which is we should fund research because it's interesting. And we shouldn't worry about, do we expect to get some immediate yield from it that we can foresee. So basically, one of the problems of the present system for science is that people, because they are under pressure, feel more need to be sure they can produce results. And that leads them, by and large, to play it safe, to apply for grants and to do experiments where the results are reasonably predictable, or at least if they're not predictable, you're pretty sure you will get a result. That makes it difficult to do very long-term projects which might or might not produce a result. But some of those long-term projects have produced some of the greatest results in science, and they probably would not be something that people would feel able to undertake today. So I'd like to see us go back to a system where we basically say, what's the intrinsic intellectual interest in the idea? Never mind if it seems to be relevant to medicine today or not, but we'll just support stuff that is really interesting in its own right, because we don't know where it will lead. And it was there was a lot of activism when the AIDS epidemic was going on to encourage more research directly related to AIDS. And the problem with that, for example, is that the cure for AIDS, if and when one comes, probably may not come from research which was directed specifically in that direction. It will come from some observation made somewhere else that wasn't anticipated at all. The nature of research is that if you can predict it, it's not so interesting. So you have to go and look for things which are harder and less predictable and more long-term in order to make the great discoveries. And if you don't support that, then science will sort of degenerate into a system in which we just explore what we know instead of discovering new things.
I hope, Dr. Lewin, and it's really more personal than anything else, that I hope they find a cure for Alzheimer's and other dementias. It's so amazing to me that they say the changes in the brain can happen 10 to 20 years prior. And how do you catch that? It's just
the brain
the million-dollar question.
Brain is by far the most difficult thing of all to do research on, for practical reasons, for ethical reasons, and we really don't understand nearly as much about it as we would like to. Most areas you can set up some sort of system. With cancer, for example, we can very often develop model systems. Really difficult with the brain, just much more difficult than anything else. But I would say that if we are succeeding in science and medicine to the point at which we are enabling people to live longer, we need to be able to make that life meaningful and high quality.
Yes, definitely. It amazes me, and I know that they're looking and researching at people that are living in their 90s and into even hundreds of why they're still functioning, and they're still being able to be cognitively fine, whereas someone who could be 60 and is having a problem.
Yeah,
and that's what fascinates me.
There's probably more genetics than environment there, sure. And we need to understand that.
Yes. And genetics, too, is also kind of, I guess it could be controversial. I guess it goes back to epigenetics of, changing someone's DNA. And, you're right.
And we're back, of course, to the old nature versus we're back to the argument about nature and the environment, which is nature versus nurture, it used to be called in the trade, in which the issue is always how much of what is going on as you get older is due to your genetics and how much is due to your environment. And that's very difficult to disentangle.
Yes, it is, because I could tell you from my own family. My dad died at 88. My mom is still alive and well for 93. God bless her. She's fantastic. And my older brother died at 67.
Yeah. Well, genetics is not a simple thing.
It sure isn't. And speaking of genetics, this just popped into my head. First cousins. And when there was a lot of intermarriage, especially among the Jewish population in Europe and even in America, of cousins marrying, people marrying within their family, I'm sure has an effect on genes and chromosomes.
It would not be. First cousins is not a good idea. It's just a little bit too close.
Yes. I think that's why my family doesn't listen to the show. I think that's why my family's messed up. My mom's parents were first cousins. And yeah, they were first cousins, and there's a lot of intermarriage among relatives in my mother's family. So I think that's there's some problems.
Intermarriage used to be the rule among the Egyptian ruling class, the pharaohs in one period, and that might well be connected with them dying out.
Yeah, it's not it wasn't legal to do that. Dr. Lewin, I enjoyed talking to you very much. It's a very interesting conversation, very interesting book. Where can people purchase your book, Inside Science?
It's on Amazon, of course. Inside Science, published by Cold Spring Harbor. Actually, all my books are on Amazon. Wine books, science books, the lot. And, of course, bookshops everywhere.
And do you have a website where people can look at your work or connect with you?
I have a website for actually wine, but not one for science. The website for wine is called winespecific.com, and I have a blog there about wine. But I don't actually haven't yet set up a website for science.
Oh, okay. And I have to ask you this out of my own curiosity. Does science and research play a role in creating great grapes which make fine wines?
Yes and no. Science has had quite a big effect on viticulture, especially enabling people to try to control the effects of climate change. Warmer climate makes it very difficult to grow some grape varieties where they've always grown. It has quite a significant effect in improving the quality of wine when you actually make the wine by understanding fermentation better and so on and so forth. But I would say great wine is not made by science or by the numbers. Great wine is made by people who really have instincts and understand how to do it.
That sounds right to me. Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Lewin. I enjoyed talking to you. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
Just that I would encourage them to support science, because in the long run, the benefits are wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yes. You are welcome. It's my pleasure to speak with you. Folks, you heard Dr. Benjamin Lewin, that is Lewin. The book, Inside Science, Revolution in Biology and Its Impact. I highly recommend buying the book, reading it, especially if you have someone very interested in science and research in your circle of friends or family. But it's very important book to get a hold of and to read. And I want to thank you all for listening today. Please read the blog, which will have information about Dr. Lewin, and Jeannie White, who's station manager, writes the blog and produces the show. So thank Jeannie for that. And I want to thank Lewin Caldwell, who's CEO of Passionate World Talk Radio, who makes this all possible. And please share the show to help other people for resources. This is why I'm here. I'm here to help people to have a better life. And there's something for everyone on my show. I have a variety of guests on all walks of life. So if you don't already subscribe to Chatting with Betsy, it is for free on Amazon Music, iHeart, Spreaker, and Spotify. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you could be anything, please be kind and shine your light bright. Because if we all did that, it would be a much kinder, brighter world, and we sure need that now more than ever. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio Network. Bye-bye now.